Hi, my name is Conor Bracken. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Findlay, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dave Lucas, Ohio Poet Laureate and author of the collection of poems Weather, out from the VQR series of poetry in 2012. Dave.
How are you?
Great to be here.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, really happy to have you. Thanks for making the trip down from Cleveland.
Thank you.
So I have a lot of questions, but I thought maybe we could start by just talking about...
I will avoid and deflect most of them if I can.
Good. It'll be that kind of interview.
Yes.
I was curious, though, I guess to start at the beginning. What was the first time that you found a poem or a poet that really kind of woke you up to the power of poetry?
Oh, it's hard to say because I think there were different experiences, as you probably know as a poet yourself. When you're a kid, there's a moment when a word will take hold of you and somehow seem magical, or a song will suddenly speak to you in a way that perhaps other people around you didn't understand. But I think that one of the first experiences that I had where I read a poem and wanted to go home and write it down was, I think I was in 9th grade reading Longfellow's The Day Is Done. And there was something very calming about it. I believe it's in ballad meter. It's a lovely, rhyming, quiet poem. And I remember reading it and feeling relaxed at the end and sort of thinking, oh, that's maybe what the poem was supposed to do. This was long before I imagined actually trying to write that sort of thing myself. And so there are other awakenings along the way. But that's one that immediately comes to mind as a moment when I recognized that poetry could do something that lasted beyond the experience between one and the page in the immediate moment.
That's really wonderful. And to come away with relaxation as the sensation as well.
Yeah, it doesn't happen often, but in that case, that was a nice thing.
Yeah.
Relaxation is not a quality I think most poets manage particularly well.
No, that whole sense of tranquility doesn't really continue much beyond. So I remember reading in one of your columns, which you're currently writing a monthly column called Poetry for People Who Hate Poetry.
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah.
Really great.
Which some people have suggested could just be called Poetry for People. Leave it at that.
But
yeah.
Ouch, that hurts.
I'm just telling you what they say.
And I got in one of those, you mentioned kind of what brought you to poetry as a writer in some ways as well. And I think a lot of us end up kind of coming to poetry for similar reasons, kind of overflow emotions. We're young, we're teenagers, we have a lot of things that we want to get out and express. But I think for as many people that come into poetry, as many people leave it as well and end up being on the other side of it. So
probably more of us should have left earlier.
That's how I feel when I'm on the job market.
That's
But so is there something you can point to that kind of grabbed hold of you? Would it be the Longfellow poem, or would it be something kind of further along the journey?
Later than that for me is when I realized that I wanted to write it. I think I had dabbled a bit in high school in the way that one does as a teenager. No one understands me, no one will ever, and so I'm writing poems that no one will understand either, and then feeling all the more frustrated that they're not being understood. That said, I took a course in college, a poetry workshop, and it just so happened that the poetry workshop was open before the fiction writing workshop was. I thought at that point that I would be a novelist, and two things happened along the way that taught me that was not going to happen. One was that I fell in love with poetry in the midst of that workshop. And the second was that later on when I was taking a fiction workshop, I realized that I could not write plot and that things and stories had to happen. Whereas in poems, and I think this is one of the wonderful things about poetry, the language itself can be what happens. And so when Auden says that poetry makes nothing happen, it is a way of happening. I like that idea, that poetry is something that happens and that language is its own plot, the movement from the beginning of the poem to the end. I don't think I could have said almost any of that at the time, but it was something that I think was there in a pre-linguistic way, and that over the years I've come to be able to articulate.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And I always love having Auden kind of brought up in conversation. Wonderful.
There's not enough Auden these days. We should be reading more Auden.
I agree. I think a lot of people get down on him for his later work, and that tends to obscure his earlier achievements.
He made some bad revisions along the way that made a difference. But speaking of not being able to relax, there's an instance.
I know, poor guy.
Martinis and amphetamines probably didn't help.
It doesn't feel like it in the moment, though. So I really like the idea of the language itself being the event that is enough for its own justification. And I tend to agree with that too. I think that Auden has a quote out there that's kind of apocryphal. That's, give me somebody who has something to say and somebody who just loves to hear the way that words hang out together.
Yeah.
And that person on the left is going to be a better poet, 9
Yeah.
times out of 10, right?
Yeah, I love that line, especially because I was the person who thought I had something important to say in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then once I realized I didn't have anything particularly important to say, it was the words that allowed me to stick around and falling in love with those that kept me around.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that really comes through a lot in your work, at least in what I've read in Weather, this incredible attention to texture.
But you haven't read the whole thing?
I've only read it 4 times at this point. I didn't have time. I don't really consider a book read until I've eaten it.
Well done. Well
I
said.
wanted to keep this one around. No, but the texture, the attention to the sound and the rhythm, I think is really, really stellar. You seem to rescue a lot of words from a certain kind of obscurity as well.
Or use others just in the wrong way.
Well, that's the beauty of poets, right?
Yeah.
You're legislating a new meaning for this word.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself coming into such kind of contact or such kind of enjoyment with words in this way?
I think part of that contact is in the subject matter, in that there are so many words that describe natural phenomena or, in the case of my native Cleveland, industrial phenomena, that are often locked into their particular contexts. If you work in a factory, you know these words, or if you are a field biologist, you know these words, or if you do some other sort of work, you know these others. And there's something to be said, I think, for bringing those words into the context of art. And for me, that's really where a lot of poetry lies, not just in a book, though, I mean, available in better bookstores everywhere. But the fact that most people experience poetry not in poems, but in the way that we make art and make pleasure of our everyday language. And so I think that the jargon of the workplace or the slang that a high school group of kids are sharing, that's a way of participating in poetry. And it's also maybe another way to answer your question from before about when was I first awakened to it. I wouldn't have known that it was poetry, but I've always loved being in groups with my friends, figuring out who's saying the coolest new bit of slang or something like that. And I think that that's where it is for most of us, even for, maybe especially for people who will never buy or read a book of poems. Nevertheless, they're still invested in poetry because it's everywhere in the language that we speak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a wonderful and more egalitarian take on poetry than I think I hear from a lot of people, which is really exciting because it deconstructs all the boundaries that exist between, the academy or whatever silos and the rest of the general public, right? Which is great. But I assume not a lot of people seem to feel that way. Where do you think these boundaries kind of erupt from? Why is it that people have so much trouble with poetry?
I think we teach them. I think we teach those boundaries,
Yeah.
and I think we could talk for a long time about the historical context of teaching poetry, complain about systems of education, complain about standardized testing and all that. But I think the simple fact of it is that if a poem like one of these is something that you study as an object in a class, that can remove some of the pleasure from it. If you don't do that with the songs that you hear on the radio, or radio, I mean, I'm dating myself there, but I still listen sometimes. If you hear that and it's pleasure, then that occupies a space of pleasure for you. When I talk to kids in kindergarten about whether or not they like poetry, they all say yes, because it's a matter of taking their language and playing with it, just doing what Auden said about enjoying the way that words sound, enjoying making them, the thin line between sense and nonsense, all of that stuff that takes us into the material of what language is, that's there until we start teaching it out. And if we teach toward riddling a poem until it gives up its deepest secrets, and that's what a poem is for, I think we remove a lot of that most primary experience that we have with it, which is sound and pleasure and beauty.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So what do you see your job as Poet Laureate of the state of Ohio to be then?
I think saying that over and
Yeah.
over again as many times as possible and in as many contexts as possible, to remind people that as important as the poem as an object is to me, as somebody who was educated in that academic tradition and who wants to write individual poems as beautifully as possible, nevertheless, being aware and making a case for the fact that poetry exists in so many places outside of poems. And that I think that actually is not to create a distinction between them, but to show how they're aligned as poems existing under this big umbrella, along with jokes and slang and lyrics and jargon and all that stuff that we make out of the language that we speak that is also poetry. So I would like to be a good joke teller. I would like to be a good slang user, and I would like to write good poems too. And so I think that's part of the way that I see the role, anyway.
Yeah. And have you been able to get through a lot of different places in your role throughout the state?
I'm working on it. Yeah, I'm working on it. Last year I did about 6,000 miles in the car in the state, and so it's a pleasure to be able to get to see different college campuses, go to different schools, go to places where perhaps poetry wouldn't necessarily be expected, at a VFW hall or something like that. Where
that's very cool.
and I think that to break down some of that idea that the poetry reading or the lecture or the talk exists in an academic space and that's it, is one of the other things that this role can allow. And also I think it's important for poetry as a whole, because if we believe, as I do, that poetry exists everywhere, and yet we only talk about it in universities and classroom settings, we're sort of setting ourselves up for failure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. I assume that you've encountered a lot of poets kind of in your travels across this great state.
Everybody's
as well.
a poet, yeah. That's what I'm finding out. Nobody wants to read it, but everyone wants to write it.
Do you have advice? So, I mean, maybe that's one of the pieces of advice you give people when you first meet them, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a poet." Like, making it, like, read poetry, I assume, is one of the ways. Or
I think that's the only thing that I know, and not just read poetry, but read everything. Read it as omnivorously as possible. That's the only advice that I believe to be true for anybody, no matter their age, no matter their background, no matter what they want to do with poetry, whether it's to write poems and publish them, or to write something that they give to a loved one in a card on their birthday, or something that they're doing just to understand themselves better. I think that whatever your goal for your poetry, whether you're a writer or a reader, or at this point neither, whatever your goal is, the only thing that I know to be true in almost every case that I've experienced is to read as much as possible. Yeah. I think everything else becomes sort of professional advice, but that's a sort of existential advice that I think is true, with a capital T.
Yeah, I can follow along with that. What are you reading nowadays? What do you tend to ingest that might not fall under the poetry rubric?
Student papers, a lot.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I know you know how this goes. Student papers. I'm going to Ireland in about 2 months, and so I've been reading up on the history of the island as a whole, but especially of the troubles in Northern Ireland. And so most of my reading has been prose about that time, but also some poetries, going back to Seamus Heaney and reading Leontia Flynn and Michael Longley and some others in that vein as well.
Yeah,
but mostly student papers. And emails. There's always emails.
Yeah, that counts.
And
Text
Instagram
messages,
captions.
Sure. Tweets.
People say that we don't read anymore. I think we read more than ever. It's just in these bursts, which we can debate as a boon or a problem. But
do you find yourself trying to write into these new forms at all? I know that you're a person who is able to move in and out of received forms in poetry. Have you been kind of trying ones that might be more contemporary in any way?
I find that there are. I do tend to like short poems that could be tweetable, but I find Twitter to be of all the social media that I'm of all I have like the 3 that I'm on. I find Twitter to be the most anxiety producing. Yeah. Facebook's just slightly less, if only because it's composed of, at this point, of just older people like me. And then I find Instagram to be an almost blissful place of just the image. Although, what's interesting about Instagram is that it seems to be the hottest medium for poetry right now, too.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the way that on Instagram, a poem is not just text, but it's also the vision of the text at the same time. And so many of the Instagram poems that have become popular are not just what's there, but the character of the font or the texture of the page that you can see behind it. So there's some visual element there as well that I think is different from, say, what you or I might do on the, well, you might be an Instagram poet. I don't know. Are you?
I mean, I've been known to wear a mask or two and dash off a romantic haiku.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's really interesting. I have not followed a whole lot of Instagram poetry, but it's good to hear that they're exploiting the form in different ways. Because you have to compensate in some ways for the loss of space, I would assume. And it sounds like they're deploying pretty interesting measures for that.
It's interesting to think about it as that visual medium again. I mean, I think of poets who have done concrete sort of work, or even instances where the character of the letter itself takes on some meaning in other languages and other alphabets. So all of that I think is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds almost Poundian.
Yeah, in some ways I think it could be. Hopefully without all the fascism, but who knows? That's back again.
It
too.
is. It could be fashionable again. Yeah, I mean, people are tweeting Mussolini again.
That's right.
It's terrible.
That's right.
Well, Dave,
you'll edit that part out, right?
Yeah. Well, it's been really great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming
here.
to Findlay, and really excited to hear your reading this evening.
Thank you for the flowers too.
Yeah, of course.
You didn't have to do that.
Well, I hope that you like pink and red roses.
I do. Thanks.
So thanks again to Dave Lucas, Ohio Poet Laureate. Really excited to have him here on the University of Findlay campus.